Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and to have friends and colleagues support us in this wonderful space. I'm Ratna Ramanathan. I head a space called Centre St Martin's that's not so far away from here. It's a College of Art and Design that's part of the University of the Arts London. And I'm delighted to be asked to chair this important conversation between these two fabulous people sitting to the left of me. Not just because they're exceptional leaders and practitioners in their field, but because of the work that they're both undertaking together. So we'll start by finding out a little bit more about this. And this feels so important to young people. There are a lot of educators here, I see, and practitioners. We've been speaking about school children as well, who Thomas often invites into the space. To really talk about the sense of Humanise and what it means to be human, which is integral to education and creative education. So I'm also here for very selfish reasons, to listen and learn from this conversation. So we'll start with introductions, and then our conversation will sort of meander across a couple of themes that actually connect these two people together. Thomas, thank you for having us in this amazing space where making is at its core and visible to the street. It's a real championing of what we do. I'm conscious that everyone here will know you, but perhaps not why we're gathered here together. So can you tell us a little bit about Humanise, what it is, and why is such an approach so fundamentally important to us?
Well, thank you so much for coming, being here, and gluing us all together tonight. And the Humanise work that we're so excited to be working with the Allen Institute on is just looking at the design of the walls of public life. And after the incredible success of the digital technologies that we've had of the last 2 decades, their brilliance has been their genius at making us have more reasons to stay at home and work, brilliant reasons to stay at home and be entertained, stay at home and study, and stay at home and get all your food delivered to you. So genius, brilliant at that, and that's convenient. But that means that we've got a kind of interesting time in public life because our streets came alive in big part because we had to be out in them. And I think there is evidence that shows that if you don't have so many people on streets, they become dangerous. And if we only need a quarter of the amounts of shops that we have now, how do we make the public space around us? It sounds nice to say it's nice to make nice public space. But once you start saying, well, it's actually dangerous in public space if there aren't lots of people there, it becomes, how do we make streets come alive? And I think, personally, I believe we've had quite a catastrophe over the last century, which was because of all sorts of reasons, but where we could get away with, sort of get by with quite inhuman environments because we still had a lot of people around. And so it feels like we have to confront that a lot of the world of designing buildings has been on the inside, thinking about how to make really good insides, even though many people would say it isn't. It's sort of not. It almost seems as if you're being a bit shallow if you're designing the outsides of buildings, but it seems like it's like the outside should be the consequence of the inside. And in the world of craft and design that I grew up in and around, there was amazing feelings that you had around different fabrics, different materials, different techniques. And we've had this sort of homogenization of outsides of buildings over the last century that has meant that things feel like they are inhuman. And I think we've gone a bit sideways because people say, oh, wouldn't it be great if everything was beautiful? And I don't think that's quite the issue.
Yeah.
And it seemed as we were starting to research and trying to understand it better, that there was a science dimension. And then it hit that, and it seemed like our brains need engagingness. And when there were studies about how people, there's one well-known study where somebody, I think it was people having gallbladder operations in 1984 in a hospital in the US. They were able, in this one precious chance, to have exactly the same people healing in a room that looked at greenery and in a room that didn't look at greenery and just looked at a wall. And the people who looked at greenery got better quicker and needed less medication.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that's because of the wafting smell of greenery or something. I don't think so, because they were behind glass. There was something in the visual, I believe. But the point is, there's so little research. And when we were researching Humanise and finding this massive industry as big as oil and gas, comparable to the finance industry, where we measure the impact of the finance industry, how effective a dollar is in the finance industry, and we measure how in oil and gas, how much oil or gas you get out of the ground for $1, that we've had this huge industry that hasn't measured its impact on our brains. And so it's sort of emerged, the more I've been researching and understanding, and this studio over the last 30 years has been a chance to learn, and in a way these are some of the learnings. But this of realizing, or realizations is a better word really, is that we're in public service when we make buildings. And I'd never heard anyone saying that in the construction industry, of saying, we design buildings, we build buildings, and we're in public service. Our buildings are in the service of the public. And even when so it's this sort of this sense that it's an art, and if you don't like what I do, you're stupid.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm interested in not the insides of buildings, because most buildings are good, they're fine. It's what's the impact on the thousands of people outside those buildings, and we haven't been measuring, we haven't been interested. And I think there's fear of measuring, because it's like, we're an art. It's like, but you're not, you're in an art that involuntary people are impacted by. So it's not, it isn't an art in that sense, it's design. Because arts like music, you can take the headphones off if you don't like what Peter's doing, or walk out of the concert. But you can't do that with the buildings that surround us in public life. And so it felt like there's a world of information, and that isn't there for us. Is how do our brains respond? And so it was so exciting when the Allen Institute said they were excited to partner and to begin a journey. There are a few neuroscientists and researchers who are looking, but I'm not trying to argue that we should go back to the lovely, traditional, beautiful buildings of the past.
Yeah.
And we don't, that's not what we do. And I'm not arguing that we should make everything curvy and organic, that we should make everything square, none of those things. It's not meant to be an ism.
Yeah.
It's like, if we were armed with information more about how people really respond, what explosion of ideas would we have? And I just found it interesting that when I've spoken about this, the design side of architectural world hates the idea of being measured. And it's like, well, you don't have to do what the research tells you, but wouldn't you want to know what it says?
Yeah.
But there won't be a it. There'll be many, many things. And it seems like that would give us more power, because I don't know of any building designer who doesn't want to do things that are loved, actually.
True. Yeah.
But there's the final thing I'd say is, in a way, so the Humanise was written for a 16-year-old or a 99-year-old to try and get away from an echo chamber. And we've had, every new building is award-winning. but who's it winning an award from? It's from other people within the industry. And so it's felt like we do need some kind of bigger conversation with society, because most people walking past feel powerless. And what could that be and look like? And so it's just so exciting. And to be here and someone saying, well, I couldn't even remember the kind of scientist. I think someone was pointing at you saying there's genomic, I can't remember what kind of scientist you were. So there's people in this room, I don't even know what kind of science it is, but that can potentially, the conversations that come out from a thing like this could, I don't know where they'll go, but
so
it can't be bad.
There's so much in what you said, I think, that I want to pick up. First is the sort of humility of a maker in terms of our constant learning, rather than assuming that we know from our professions, because you're both accomplished. So there's a real sense of learning and crossing boundaries. The spaces we occupy, but some uncomfortable things that you've said about emotions, perhaps, and well-being, that I feel is important for us to sort of pick up in the conversations. Rui, you were smiling throughout when Thomas was saying, and excited in parts. Tell us a bit more. You're the president of the Allen Institute. Tell us, about Allen's interests, but also your daily life as a neuroscientist.
It's great being here. It's the beginning of a journey and a dream. So the Allen Institute.
We can hear you.
This is feedback.
Yeah.
The Allen Institute was founded 20 years ago by Paul Allen, and it operates in life sciences a little bit differently than traditional academia. It goes after big questions and then puts together multidisciplinary teams to achieve a goal, a milestone. And we have studies in cells, in the immune system, and a lot in the brain. So we just finished mapping all the cell types and a lot of the connectivity of the mammalian brain for the first time. Now, another challenge is how the brain works. And one of the areas we mapped first and we saw how it works is exactly the visual system. And one interesting thing is sameness leads to actually lack of response of the visual system. So if something novel happens now, and it doesn't need to be huge, right? It could be something I don't expect in the texture of that column, right? My neurons in the visual are spiking, are active. If I predict it, I actually have the mirror image, and we observe, and this is a great study we actually did, the response is canceled symmetrically. So there's something about, and that's very good, because otherwise we'd be always gazing and saccading and looking around. So there's something in difference and the not sameness that captures our attention, and it is part of our narrative. Mm-hmm. With more attention or surprise, you actually learn better, and you move. You have a physicality, a response to spaces. And we also study a lot the concept of learned helplessness, when you feel that the environment around you, there's nothing you can do. And so more and more, we think what we learn in neuroscience is, of course, important to know what we are and to cure diseases. Right? 3.4 billion humans will have some type of brain, mental health, or degeneration problem. It's amazing right now. But more than that, knowledge about neuroscience can be applied to everyday life, to education, to the design of our cities, to the design of buildings. So people tend to walk and be surprised and be more creative and be more engaged if there's more difference. Certain shapes, I know you're saying it's not curved or whatever, but things that look like nature capture us more, mixture of elements. Our brain is mostly the same for the last 10,000 years. There's not much evolution. Our digestive system, for example, evolved more as we moved around. So there's something about this that can create within a similar environment, more interesting, less interesting. We were talking even when people built homes that were supposedly exactly the same and full neighborhoods. After a while, people perversely start changing their home, and mine has a little bit different. And our clothes, the exterior of buildings are the clothes of buildings. We all came here, look at us. We all have something slightly different. It doesn't need to be very expensive. Why is that, right? It goes beyond shelter, right? Beyond protection from the weather. There's something about this interaction. And so it is an experiment to start to go across a little bit in the humanities. In education, it's starting, how do we design better schools? But it's not only curriculum, it's actually the physical space, objects, how do you interact, how do you fidget? So to measure things, and it doesn't need to be only brain EEGs, it could be how people react, how their bodies move. Do they fixate their attention? Are they shifting their attention around? This is an exciting new possibility, and to design experiments, again, cross-disciplinary with a new type of creativity. I'm not going to say it's simple, it's complex, but we seem to like complexity, right, even in cities. Right?
Thank you, that's a great start. And it also touches on Thomas's point about like craft and design and reacting to material. Tell us a little bit, both of you, in terms of, so there's something about this change in thinking, or you're opening eyes to seeing and thinking differently. You're bringing the surprise into the conversation. So the interior of the brain, so the design of the brain, and Thomas, the interior of our cities, really, which we don't really consider in terms of the external fabric of our buildings. What is the hope for this new kind of practice and thinking, the journey that you're both embarking on and coming together? Can you tell us briefly about the hopes of bringing this together? And Thomas, your point about measurement as well.
Well, I suppose my hope is that maybe the analogy that I found useful was a neuroscientist, architectural teacher, sort of gave me the challenge and said, if we're talking about a fruit loaf, and are you saying it's all fruit? And that's not the thing. And in our studio, we tend to get asked to do the fruit pieces in a fruit loaf. I don't know if this is going to work. I'm going to try and make this work.
I'm with you.
But the conversation really is about the bready bit in between, and what's the nutritional value of that. And if we use nutrition as a way of talking about it, in the world of food, we do now talk about the nutritional value of ultra-processed food. But 40 years ago, you were a hippie if you talked about that. And so it felt like society couldn't change, and it was only the outliers. But society does move. And we started to see it as actually something that you could talk about and that was part of society's essential things that matter. But we haven't had the same with buildings. But if we start to look, and I think it was science that helped us get there, and I think we've got stuck in I like this and you don't like that, and about aesthetic styles. And I think if you step back and shift it, and that's why I think science will be so useful, will be to inform us, and I think that will probably be the thing that kind of unlocks, if we actually understood the mental health impact of buildings. Exactly. And we've done polling across the UK. We've worked with an independent agency who spoke to 2,000 people across the UK. And 76% of people said buildings affect their mental health. But there is no mental health training for us in the industry. Yeah. If we are making buildings that are the walls of public life, that will be there, should be there for centuries, not just decades. And so, what an opportunity, what an honour it is to build a building that will sit there for decades. It's an honour and a huge responsibility. But if you sort of then think, oh, well, this is a nice conversation. And come on, surely there's an environment crisis and there's Ukraine and that kind. We've got this nice, is this really a time for a nice conversation? Where it gets serious is because of the environmental impact. So even if you don't care about what buildings look like, we've got the average age of a commercial building in the UK is 40 years. So if I was a commercial building, I would have been killed 15 years ago. And so the serious question is, how do you make society care? How do you make someone who hasn't come to your lecture, who's the child of the child of the child of the daughter of the wife of the whatever, someone who you will never meet, why might they care enough to say, no, don't knock it down. Why don't we just extend it? We could take the roof off. Or why don't we adjust it or adapt it? And I think I just sort of have noticed that the design of products, it's great having here Sebastian, who actually taught me at the Royal College. And you know, you were very much thinking in design, and Sebastian's father, who was so generous to me as a mentor, was thinking about how would somebody feel? What were you doing? How would it make someone else feel? And so feelings was a normal conversation and emotion. In the world of car design, emotion is discussed a lot. You are designing for the emotion of people. Yeah. And because there's a different kind of purchasing, it's on an individual sort of basis. But with buildings, which will be there for decades and decades and decades, impact millions of people, you only need to persuade about 4 or 5 people, and it happens. And we've had a very intellectualized, and it feels like there hasn't been a balancing side of the emotional designing for actually the biggest users who will never be in the room. And it was such a big lesson for me getting to know a city planner who we'd worked with. And he was talking about this funny, weird setup that when we get planning permission for a big building project, there'll be an article and it'll say, Heatherwick Studio wins planning. And he was saying, who do you think I represent? And so this was actually the head planner for King's Cross that we work with on the coal drops. And he said, I represent the public. And he said, what I find your industry doesn't understand is that you have 2 clients. You don't have one client. One client is the customer client, and the other client is the public. And when it says Heatherwick Studio wins planning, who did you beat? Did you want to beat the public? Now, I know there are different strengths of planner. There's some are better than others. But it's this thing of being in public service. I haven't heard people talking about I'm in public service. I have 2 clients, and one is the public. Yeah. And even with building assessing, because when talking about the impact of outsides of buildings, I spoke to a very well-respected someone who runs a large firm, and they said, at the end we speak to users, and we do this post-occupancy survey to see how successful our project is. And we ask 45 questions. I thought, wow, fantastic. And said, who do you ask them to? And they're the people inside the building. No one is asking 45 questions to the 15-year-old who just walked past the outside, or the gang of Bangladeshi ladies who were there earlier. And they're not paying, they'll never come in. So how do we understand, if we without consultation and speaking to everyone on the planet, which you can't do, but are there any universal truths, or not even universal ones, just what can we learn about if we're going to design things that connect with other people's emotions, because without their emotions, they won't care, and if they don't care, they might not fight for it to stay up. And the carbon, the dirty secret of our industry is that the carbon is 5 times the impact of the aviation industry, which society does talk about, but we don't talk about the buildings.
Yeah, multi-generational, multicultural.
Yes.
Yeah, and the sense of impact. Rui, your thoughts on this?
So, I guess there's feedback. I'll step back one. So for me, the main goal or the dream is that science and technology are perceived by everyone as being available to change our everyday life. We understand the impact, for example, of science and life sciences on health. And if we have a discovery, and I tell you, this particular cell seems to die in this disease, or this molecule is altered, then I go to an industry that says, oh, let me test millions of compounds that could perhaps alter these, and trials are run to see if there's something that can be applied. Now, we're not there in other things, like in education or the planning of cities, but there is knowledge, basic knowledge, for example, this thing of the surprise, which is not big surprise, but our brain actively seeks information. So if this room would be, mostly sameness on one side and then a lot of detail and complexity in one part, our eyes would go more to that part. We want to seek information, to sample real bits of information and visual information. We know that. Like we know other things about how the brain learns, or even the embodiment. The next phase would be, how do you apply these? There's no equivalent of the life sciences or pharmaceutical industry that goes and tests, does now experiments. Oh, based on that, and you said, nature forms and this and that, based on this, or surprise. For example, what's the real impact on mental health, right? What works, what doesn't work? It's an experiment, right? I mean, I don't know, how do people learn better? How do people keep their attention, right? For how long? What grabs the attention? What makes people more engaged? What makes people walk and move? Many less people walk in sameness, I don't want to say boring, but sameness neighborhoods, right? But wherever there's interesting things, people are doing stuff, interacting. So in the old psychology, there's this theme of affordance. But in mental health, and I have here actually an ex-colleague that is a psychiatrist. So if you tell me today, yes, I want a brain to influence how we design objects, how we design buildings, how we design cities, there is knowledge. But there's no dialogue, there's no experimentation, try and measure, like we do for other things. Yeah. Is it complex? Yes, again. But it doesn't need to be pseudoscience, right? It could be done rigorously, even measuring how people occupy spaces or do. I was looking below your building the whole weekend in preparation how people use these, and it's very different. The people that come from outside as tourists versus the kids from the local it's a wonderful skateboard place, like all those stairs and stuff. And there's people doing dance and badminton, and there's spaces for everything, right? So very rich space. There's water in one part, there's different types of materials. So these, it doesn't need to be so complex. It's simple. But I think I would love if we scientists, I think, have the obligation to say knowledge, and one of the big things of the Allen Institute is everything is open science. So we publish everything openly, and we want people to use it. But open science without impact, it's not open science. We want people to understand everything that science does can influence my life. When you press an elevator, there's electronics that came from science. You trust that, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with safety in the streets. But it can be more. It can be about how you build things to make them, and even affordances, certain ways that your body interacts better with things or walks better in spaces.
So for me, I'm thinking a little bit about what you're saying in terms of the surprise, because I think when we're children, we don't distinguish necessarily we don't have that distinction between disciplines in the sense, but we learn that separation. But you're both using quite common language, which is unusual for makers and scientists to come together with language and to cross boundaries. So we have Christopher Smith, who actually is our exec chair of the HRC here, And he speaks about the danger of these boundaries, which I think, Thomas, you've also referred to. And he says, actually, we spend so much time arguing what is art or design and what's science, but actually the humanities are human science because it's about the human and the impact on the human. So it feels like also not just about the two of you and the work that you're doing, but it feels like a very important moment, given where we are in the world, about bringing those worlds together and working across boundaries. Now, both of you have sort of used language about, in the theme of your work, you can see the presence and the power of the head. I think you've both mentioned thinking. You've mentioned being, the heart, and you've mentioned a lot of practice in hand and making. And this seems really fundamental, Thomas, to your point about the fabric of urban life, and to your work, Rui, on the mysteries of life or surprise. So it is also the focus very much for our young people in creative education. Why, in your opinion, is this combination of the head and the heart and the hand important, Thomas, and then Rui?
I mean, I just think buildings are the buildings are the biggest objects we make, and so it felt to me that I'd seen sensibilities at small objects, whether that was jewelry or loaves of bread, with incredible the way that when they rise, the forms they make and textures, or just other scales had a sort of sensuousness. And then I came to buildings and just went, like, what happened? Why did they become so flat, so plain, so monotonous, so shiny? And it felt that there was a whole world of sort of sensuousness that is even more important if it's going to be 50,000 times the size of the earrings. Yeah. And so we don't have unlimited money. So it's kind of, how do you find, what is the amount of detail and necessary visual complexity that we need to put in things? Because it certainly seemed that we had shaved off, that we had an artistic movement that when it hit buildings caused a problem, because it gave permission to spend the least possible in history on buildings. And it felt, and I do think you need to spend probably a tiny bit more, just like if you have green buildings, there is a green premium. You do spend a tiny bit more to make a building really perform in a sustainable way, from insulation, more insulation, better performing windows, better performing energy generation. Those things cost a little bit. But to then say it's sustainable, to really be sustainable, people have to care about it as well. So I think it's important to define what that is. And but to your point, we are leading the Seoul Architecture Biennale this year. I've been appointed as the general director, and so we're getting different architects designing walls of public life. We're going to do full-size pieces of buildings. But we're also getting some people from worlds of fashion who think about outsides and feelings and textures and those kind of things. But I think so. The thing is, building, the world of building is a huge thing, and it needs many people's hands and voices. It's like you need an orchestra to make a building. You don't have just a soloist do it. And so we need to move beyond the image of the soloist to the sense of the orchestra working on it. But we've got this sort of toxic combination of, we discovered we could spend less. It's a bit like with ultra-processed food. It's a way to make food cheaper. So you could say, how wonderful, how democratic. But it's like, but we lose something. And there was a researcher called Michael Benedict in the US, because all my career I've had people saying, oh, very expensive, you're very expensive, about whenever you try and say you want to do something with a little bit more qualities to them. And he actually turned that to me, upside down, because his research showed, well, looking back at the relative costs of buildings now, relative costs of buildings a century ago, going further back, that actually it's cheaper now than ever relative to GDP to build buildings. And look how much we've built across the planet. And so it's not true. They didn't have cranes, they didn't have roads, they didn't have lorries. Labour was probably a bit cheaper, but we've chosen to spend less. And I think it's important we all look at each other and say we're choosing, because then you can say, oh, very expensive for anything beyond that. But it's about how society chooses to spend the money that we have, and how we look at value over time as well.
Yeah. So it's not just for our own generation, but for, you speak about 1,000 years that a building should be able to adapt, live, be a part of a space,
We've been trying to think about one of the sessions that Matt and I, who's working with me on the Biennale, have been thinking about is how, one of the sessions we might have there is how to be a good ancestor.
Yeah.
Trying to think, what are the decisions that we will make now as a good ancestor?
That's right.
That will really impact the child of the child of the child of the child of the child.
Yeah,
someone you will
absolutely.
never know. What
yeah.
can we imagine things like that?
There's a 1,000-year-old church about 5 minutes from here, in the St. Pancras Gardens. I went there, and I was thinking, how did they lift these stones and to make an arch? Can you imagine? It's 1,000 years old. They put a lot of effort, certainly, in that. So to your 2 points, I have to address this idea, and now I'm going to talk about my own views of my own science, not about the Allen Institute, but something you said is interesting. So in my view, the brain starts working from the womb when it develops and is ongoing, and sensory things come and tame or bias, but don't drive the brain. The brain is going. Mm-hmm. Forever until about 8 minutes after you die or your heart stops, but it's going. And so you can consider early on.
8 minutes after you're dead.
No, I was thinking.
It's still boring buildings.
Now probably 48 hours if you do it. But anyway, so one interesting thing is when we as children were evolving, we use objects not in a standard way, right? If you teach someone how to bounce, they go get the plate, I'll bounce the plate. It doesn't bounce. You try, and that divergent creativity is much higher. And learning and specialization, is very useful, but can also be considered as the closeness of possibility and opportunity. So one of the things that when you get to be an expert in the field that this requires, and again, I don't have the answers if these will work, but it requires humility. As an expert in neuroscience, you come and talk to someone that builds buildings, and you have to listen. Even if they use a language that sounds very different, you're like, okay, they are saying something, they know their craft, my language doesn't correspond. I need to inhibit all my prejudice and bias that I acquired through expertise and listen. Yeah, I had a wonderful experience. I research on learning and movement when I had to go through physical therapy or when I did dance. Because from the people that were interacting with me, I would learn things about small micro movements, posture adjustment before initiation, and then it influenced experiments I did in the lab. But it came from very different people. So the first thing I would say, I think we all need a bit of humility and be like, let's listen a bit. It doesn't mean everything will work in a scientific way, but we need to co-design experiments, right? That would make sense to both parts. The second part that you mentioned is very interesting because the most recent things that excite me in neuroscience, and Alana is here, she studied the movement, is more the connection of, the head, the feel, and the movement are all embodied and not so separate. And I was telling Peter Gabriel here. So I was just looking at the study that works even in Drosophila and the little fruit fly, and also in humans. If you physically avoid something that's scary, or you approach physically, something that is appetitive. It actually, you learn it better with the physicality, and it's actually the proprioceptors for backward and forward movement influence your approach or repulsion. So your body responds to something, actually enhances the thing or not. And if you're told to be very quiet, even a very scary thing is less, or very still, is less scary, or a pleasurable thing less pleasurable. Same if now we can have methods in which we can control the heart rate artificially. So your brain is not sending your body, we just boop, 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 can put it up or down, and we can make ourselves, or even, little mice, more anxious, less anxious. There's no threat. It's just your body, your physicality. So the thinking, the emotion, and the actually movement, they're all embodied in an organism. And that organism is embodied in the world. And we don't pay attention to the world in which it's embodied. In early education, people start paying attention, like, oh, the materials and the ways playgrounds are matter, right? But we're children until we die, and even the aging population. One of my big passions, both in Lisbon and New York, is how do we design cities for the 50-plus society? More than 50% of the UK, of the Western world, is going to be 50-plus. And there's different things that cause attention. And so both of these aspects are very interesting to me. The multidisciplinarity and the humility to maybe think knowledge comes in many ways. And for scientists, we're trying, no, this is knowledge, this is not knowledge. And the other part is how even things we've separated as different functions of our nervous system and our body seem to be so integrated together to a way that we didn't perceive,
Something about what you're saying about, I'm sorry to say, really profoundly moved by it in the sense of difference. In a world that's rejecting difference in a big way, there's a message there about also starting with us, with just our heads and our hearts and our minds. Thomas, did you want to come in with something?
I was just going to say that two weeks ago there was an article saying that even babies find boring buildings boring. And I think they were, the idea that the babies would like the super simplistic forms. And the scientists who did that bit of research are coming tomorrow to the symposium happening here, so I'm looking forward to speaking to them. But what slightly freaked me out by Peter Gabriel being here was when I watched the research you did with chimpanzees. And so I'm there thinking, why do we call it humanized? It's not chimpanise, but how do animals equally respond to these? I'm sure there's many things that we have in common in how different species of monkey would respond to forms, textures, visual complexity.
They don't build boring stuff.
They don't do
it.
No. Well, no animals. No animal builds boring things except us.
So there's a really important question there, isn't there? What does it mean to be human in a more than human world? And that brings in both technology as well as other intelligences.
There's also one aspect. Thomas is not going to like this. And of course, it can cost a little more money. But it can still, if you have knowledge for the same money, clothes now are inexpensive and we all combine different things. After one conversation with Thomas, I was drawing a building with a scarf, right? It's a cheap way. Sometimes you don't have an expensive, you put a little scarf. And
you're talking about handbag and stilettos on the building. Okay, when you dance.
Exactly, when you dance. But so there's an aspect also of equity and the separation in society. What Thomas is talking about, the buildings he now builds that usually are a museum, the vessel, right, in New York, attracts people. People go. These are exceptional buildings, exceptional in the design, but exceptional in the sense no one is commissioning these for everyday life, for a residential area. Now, if there is influence of all these is education, learning, interaction, look at the separation we're doing in society. Some can afford, and your neighborhood is attractive. You walk, there's people outside. Your neighborhood is boring, is not attractive. There's not a lot of stuff to interact. This is a little perverse. So we need to be aware about this equity of opportunity, especially for you talk about transgenerational. So our brain for the past 10,000 years, as I said, didn't evolve much. But what we do today is very different. And it's transgenerational memory and learning. In about 25 years, we learn almost the whole history of humanity. In sports, in music, you learn the matter, the art, the artifact, all the skill of all the previous ones. So our brain has immense capacity to learn. But that transgenerational thing means you want better for the other one.
Yeah.
If all of a sudden we think, oh, the next generation is going to be raised in this type of environment, and there's influences. Look, there's a crazy study that was done, it was not allowed, in an orphanage where they put people with no interaction. And the experiment was, they thought Esperanto was the natural language it would evolve if you never contact any human. So you learn, but there's a natural innate language that would come. So they took an orphanage, did this experiment. Most kids died because of lack of interaction and with severe immune deficiency.
Are we doing any experiments like that?
No.
Just wanted to...
No. We're doing the opposite experiment.
We
but anyway, so there's a part of equity of, and again, much of these may not work, but that's science. That's, you may go and say, oh,
try.
This one makes no difference, right? If you do it like that or like this, and we need to be able to accept that, right? To accept the answer of the measurements, right? Even if we think this is more beautiful, more interesting, but if it doesn't make a difference, it doesn't. But we need to measure.
Rui said earlier that for the first time in history, IQ is starting to go down. Which was I don't know. I wonder.
So there is there's a lot of studies recently about, are we happy? And I think I'm obsessed now with happiness of young people. So the World Happiness Report, and the latest one has come out just this week, talks about the fact that our young people are the least happy that they've ever been since we started measuring. So talking about measuring happiness. I'm reminded of sort of Toni Morrison, who said actually practice is more important than happiness. When we spoke, Thomas, you spoke about happiness being, the absence of unhappiness, and I think it was one of your clients, the Abbot of Worth, who sort of mentioned that. Can you tell us a little more about that and about the importance of happiness and this idea of joy and boring, the kind of emotions you're trying to bring in?
We did some work with the Abbot of Worth, who's a Benedictine monk who was leading the community in Worth in Sussex. And we helped them finish the church there. And he wrote a book called Finding Happiness. And one of the chapters is called The Happy Death. And I remember sort of thinking, well, how can those two things go together? And the book begins by redefining happiness, because I'd assumed happiness was a sort of smile, and his point is that might be a moment of laughter or something, but actually happiness is the absence of unhappiness, and and it's true. Sometimes, there's a couple of people I've known who, if your face is like this, they say, smile, you'll be happy. And you're there thinking, I am actually happy. And you don't have to be sort of cranking your muscles up to be happy. But in designing things, I was also struck by we are talking with the campaign work about how do we make the world, the buildings that are getting built radically more joyful. But within that, it's because we've had such serious and a sense of seriousness, which it is very serious, the act of spending that much money for something that's that permanent. But there has to be a lightness of spirit as well in what, at the end, in what you give people somehow or other. But I went to see one particular project where there was a bar, and the person who had been involved in commissioning it was there, and she said, this bar was commissioned to be melancholy. And I thought that was really amazing, in that there's also pleasure in melancholy, and there's all the different kinds of emotion that we can feel that can also be part of an enriched life. So I think my interest is in no way homogenizing anything, but I hope it's supercharging the potential to put stories back. This is what the head of urban design for Singapore said. She said, buildings don't tell stories anymore.
Yeah.
And we've sort of scraped culture off buildings very proudly because less was more and ornament was a crime and form follows function.
Yeah.
But actually, that's what you do if we're just robots. But actually, we are our culture and our stories. That's what and points of view, which artificial intelligence doesn't really have a point of view. And so we need, it's sort of doubling down on the things that do make us really special and different from just automated things. And so I'm sort of interested in, my hope is that we can have an explosion of artisticness back into the world around us, but whatever that is, and things that might be splendidly ugly, but still engaging.
And surprising.
From the point of view of the brain and the body and mental health, happiness is a complex word, and unhappiness, there are many types of things that would fall in either category. And depression, I would argue, or depressions are not just unhappiness. There are many different components. And so all of these, right, needs to be dissected much more in a way. The joy we feel if we eat chocolate or ice cream upstairs after these is a very different type of joy, that type of immediate reward, than at the other extreme, the joy of a life well lived. Eudaimonia. And my friend Morten just started a center in Oxford to try to study these. After studying reward and addiction all his life, the lifelong happiness or joy, which doesn't mean every moment is happy, but it's a life well lived. You feel it was worth it. In depressions, for example, there's apathy, there's lack of reaction, there's sometimes extreme pain, including physical pain that you feel. So I think all these things need to be dissected. Some factors are starting to be studying why we have more. I mean, it is true that in terms of the surveys, there's more mental health problems in the youth, and it's probably multifactorial, right? I mean, the environments we are, including the virtual environments, the social things. I mean, Alana, you're a psychiatrist. You could talk to everyone about this. This is your work. So Alana worked with me as a scientist.
I have a lot of young patients. I love them. They don't actually talk about buildings.
So that's true. But maybe they feel the buildings.
They feel the cost of them.
Yes.
Talk about rent.
So we make it same cost.
There's, just to switch out, I think, a little bit, there's something very brave about this book in terms of the change in language. Rui, there's something amazing about Alan Impact saying we need to listen to difference, we need to learn from each other, and that we have our own limitations of our disciplines. We're in an age, in a moment in time, where we lack good leadership, or brave leadership, or leadership that embraces difference, that speaks about the value of happiness or the range of emotions for everybody, not just the people who can afford it. So to leave us today with the message of hope, because this isn't just a nice conversation, we're all holding it together, what would you like to leave us with, Rui and Thomas, to finish?
Look, scientists are inherently optimists because most experiments fail. And you still do it, so somehow you spend your life pursuing the thing, and it's a labor of passion, of curiosity to do things. And this type of interaction is also an interaction of optimism, right? That we come here, I mean, as you know, it's very uncomfortable. I'd rather not be here in front of everyone speaking about this, but I do it because I think we need to get a little bit out of the comfort zone. Even if we're wrong, you need to make bets and explore. You know, if we don't take risks, obviously I wouldn't be wrong. There's a lot we could be wrong from just this conversation we had here. If I would say, no, the brain is great, we're finding some things for disease, no one would criticize this opinion, right? I would never be ridiculed. But is this the goal? Or do we need these things? The other part you mentioned, you know, I have strong opinions about the importance of science and education for society or equality. But I try to think sometimes, how can I bring others along? You know, if I say to someone, you don't understand science, you're so dumb, you know. It's like, I'm the scientist. If they don't understand, what's my responsibility? Did I explain? Did I bring them along? Is science influenced? Do they know everything they do is influenced by some science? So there's a responsibility, I think, in bringing people along, and I think it's cyclical in societies that we go more convergence, more divergence. If we all would have a common enemy, if there would be real life outside, then all of a sudden all humans are, you know. When I went to the US, I was no longer Portuguese, I was European. All the Europeans were hanging out, and the Iberians more, right? The Portuguese and Spanish. We fought for 800 years, right? It was like, brother, brother, brother. So there's something about this, and it's too much. It's too quick to the insult, to the other is wrong, to the other doesn't know. Somehow, I think, although I feel sometimes like doing that, I don't think that's the right thing. And I think in these areas where we don't know, we actually need to listen, sit together, and think, how do you design? And there's, Thomas, one thing I love and that we agree is, there's not going to be one solution. There's many, many potential solutions. It's like treatments. It's like life. There's not a one-to-one. There's not one right and one wrong. There's going to be many rights and many wrongs, things that work, things that won't. It could be different for different cultures. It could be different at different times. We don't know. But just being present sometimes is a message that we want a better world.
I feel very optimistic and wary of pessimism. Architecture is really tough. I mean, you get knocked over all the time because things are over budget. You don't get planning permission for this, for that, for that. So you're knocked around all the time. And so I remember when I was studying, and I went and interviewed lots of people in the world of construction, and I saw so many people were hardened. They just sort of became hardened, and it seemed like, how do you not be hardened? How do you sort of find a way to be resilient without becoming sort of hardened? And it seems that, I mean, my optimism comes from also how responsive people are when you put love into something. And when you think of it through their eyes and think about how would somebody feel about what we do. So we try in the studio to not think, what do we think, but imagine what would somebody else think. You can't ask everybody what everyone will ever think, but within yourselves, you can really try and imagine the Ratner. You can imagine the 14-year-old of yourself and think how you would feel. And so I think, and we've found that people just respond so positively about that. And they're also, I mean, maybe this is a sad thing, is people's expectations are so low that when you do something special, they're like surprised and happy. Then the other side of and so we're working in places all over the world where people, it's like logical, people want places that are interesting and engaging. But the funny thing with us is a friend of the studio once said to me, you can only work in an optimistic economy. And I remember sort of, because, I mean, some of our buildings are really inexpensive, but because they might have some curves on, people assume they must be really expensive. And so you find that, and annoyingly, they were right. It's, so if you want to see where in the world is optimistic, you look at where we're being asked to do things. But they're not all high budget projects. But in terms of the campaign side of things, I'm optimistic because even already, I mean, it's just amazing to be here. I'm optimistic because of this. But I'm also optimistic because when I was little, I saw master plan drawings, and you just think, what is that? And it felt like forever in the future. But I've watched how things, maybe it's getting older, but they really happen. Like King's Cross was a master plan for years. Yeah. And then suddenly it started to really happen, and there it is. And now it's a place that many people have stories and emotions and and it can be a lot better, and next phases will be. But to have seen time move and things shift in sensibility. My dad's parallel, which I think my dad said, don't use this one, it doesn't really work, but I'll try it anyway, is the campaign for real ale. Because my dad, was just there like, well, it's industrial-made beer. And, but, the people campaigned. And the idea of well-made, kind of crafted beer, I don't even drink beer, but anyway, camera, that's what they're called, camera. It's shifted, and now every pub has got a real ale, something or other, real ale here, there, and so I know that what sounds like an annoying thing to say, it sounds like unachievable, expensive. Like, how are you going to get developers? How are you going to get planners? But it's so, like, everybody knows there's a problem. You speak, like when we speak to just people who aren't in the construction industry, all nod and just go, yeah, absolutely, there's a problem. But their sense of agency is so low because buildings are so big, expensive, done by a world that they don't know who they even are. So I do have the sense that things can change, but it's about public conversation. Yeah. And that's why this campaign really is not about our industry, it's about the public side of things.
Thank you so much. That master plan has a soul, and we enjoy it.
Look who brings it alive.
I know, and we enjoy it daily, especially the children playing in the fountain outside Central St. Martin, so it has a life. I think both of you are examples of small, little acts of resistance, because you seek to challenge and push yourselves on a daily basis, and that's something for us to sort of take hope. We can be small, creative acts of resistance. It seems like this world needs it. And profoundly, both of you have spoken about when we make, we believe in a future. And that is the most hopeful thing for us to be in education, in designing buildings, or thinking about the brain. Thank you so much for this evening's conversation.